So a lot of what constitutes civilization and contemporary society depends quite heavily on software in various forms. And most of this software is developed privately by companies like, Facebook, Amazon, Google, etc. The big ones, the enemies, the biggest enemies of the people that are currently living. And most of the software that these companies are developing, and which gets used in a defense context, for instance, is developed open source, which means that the code is available on some GitHub somewhere. You can go in, you can copy it. A lot of the licensing for this type of software, it's some variation of the GPL, meaning that you can copy the code, redistribute it, and modify it, generally with the proviso that you cannot make money off of it, just to undercut competition. So that, the idea of that, and the reason that open source has taken off and become almost, I guess, the dominant paradigm for how software is developed in contemporary society is that things happen faster, things get developed more quickly, and there's a greater security in having open source software so that other developers can look at your code, point out potential vulnerabilities. Anybody can make a pull request and submit changes to the software. So there's always innovation happening on a very decentralized and distributive kind of network, so that anybody who has the capability to actually make meaningful change to a code database is able to do so, which is a pretty good and efficient method for distributing and developing code. It's worth pointing out that Git, which is the major version control, which is a huge part of how open source functions today, was developed by Linus Torvalds, who developed the Linux kernel as well. And the Linux kernel, obviously there's a meme that it's actually GNU/Linux, the kernel, and then all of the software that runs alongside of it, and without which the kernel would count for nothing. And that software, that GNU software, was developed by Richard Stallman in large part in his Free Software Foundation. I don't know if it's actually developed by him individually or his foundation. I don't know the precise history. It might be another organization that he was part of back in the day or something. But Richard Stallman is the guy behind GNU, which is the second half of the GNU/Linux operating system. And Richard Stallman is very famous for being a proponent of free software, which is a distinct category of software from open source software, having to do with the license. So the license for free software must allow any user to be able to modify, distribute, use the code, or use whatever, however they like. Free software is anti-copyright, and it pertains a lot to privacy and security and all these sorts of important questions. But so Richard Stallman developed this free software Ethos. It's really a whole branding thing for him. He was canceled recently, about 2 years ago or something, maybe even less sooner than that. But so the distinction between free software and open source software is that open source, anybody can develop on it, whereas free software, it needs to be anybody can own it, change it, modify it, redistribute it however they like. And it's more of an ethical distinction. It's more also like an economic distinction. Really, it's not so much an ethical distinction as it is an economic distinction. It means like free software means that anybody who, like, software cannot be copyrighted, it cannot be privatized, and it can't, I don't really know if you could use it to make money off of, but it's an important distinction because, like, Richard Stallman is cancelled, and, there's the question of whether or not the FSF has relevance. But I think what is really important to think about in the context of free and open source software is how it relates to like social economics and like the mode of production that is paradigmatic at a given time. In our time, I'm beating around the bush, it's capitalism, and free software doesn't work under capitalism. For the concept to be fully realized, it can't be under capitalism. It is inherently an anti-capitalist, or at least like an anti-market like ideology. Free software is really best expressed, I think, as an ideology. I mean with certain like real-world and material implications, like the GPL license, for example. But like the reason that free software cannot really be realized as a concept except outside of a marketplace is because like it's like what happened with Firefox is that because like Firefox is like a free and open source project or whatever, but because it had to endure for a long time in a marketplace, it needed to be able to compete with other like capitalist enterprises that were about like getting a profit. In order to be innovative, like any kind of corporation, even if it's like a charity or an NGO or whatever, it needs to like eventually become concretized as a capitalist corporation, and like there's just no possibility for like free software really existing independently of a marketplace. It was always inevitable that free software is vulnerable to being co-opted by the neoliberal regime, which is like really what has happened with open source. Open source was like a concept that was generated by capitalism's desire to, or like a need, not desire, but like it like corrupts everything that it touches. Like it turns everything into like, and nothing can exist within capitalism without like operating by the same principle of generating surplus value as every other corporation. So free software cannot exist without becoming like market incentivized to an extent, which is why like and like the reason that open source software is able to develop so effectively is not through like altruism of developers who are just like working on things on their own time. Like these developers are being paid by big corporations, like that is their job to develop open source software, whereas free software like does not allow itself to be like used and co-opted in the same kind of way as open source software. It cannot like be acclimated to a market concept. So I mean I'm really hesitant to like say that free software is anti-capitalist in any meaningful sense, because there's no necessary like politics to it, but it is anti-market at least. Like it cannot be integrated into a market because like you cannot privatize, you cannot generate profit off of free software. Anyway, that is just a small distinction between free and open source software that I want to make. I think it's pretty relevant given the present social context and how like dependent we have become on open source software, which is really just a corruption of an ideal that was not necessarily pure, but which was it had some more potential And as communists, it is worth thinking about what the possibility, or not necessarily the possibility, but how we should be thinking about these sorts of things, about software and about copyright and licensing. And I think free software provides a pretty good model, but as with so many things under capitalism, it is ambiguous by its nature, and was made to take the path of surplus accumulation. Anyway, that's it for now.